long before the name Kykuit became associated with manicured terraces, sweeping views of the Hudson River, and one of the most influential families in American history. The land it occupies was part of a quiet, rolling stretch of countryside in what was once known as North Tarrytown, later renamed Sleepy Hollow, a region shaped by Dutch settlement, farming traditions, and river commerce, where the Hudson functioned as both lifeline and boundary, carrying goods, people, and ideas between New York City and the interior of the state. And it was into this landscape that John D. Rockefeller, already one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world by the late 19th century, began to look northward for a retreat that could offer privacy, control, and distance from the pressures of urban life, not as an impulsive display of wealth, but as a calculated extension of the same principles that had governed his business career: discipline, order, efficiency, and long-term planning. And in the 1890s, as industrialization reshaped American cities and fortunes like Rockefeller's redefined the upper limits of personal wealth, the idea of a country estate took on new meaning, no longer merely a seasonal escape, but a carefully constructed environment meant to reflect values, authority, and permanence. And Rockefeller's initial interest in the Hudson Valley was influenced by its proximity to Manhattan, its established reputation among elite families, and its landscape, which combined dramatic river views with enough land to ensure seclusion. And unlike some contemporaries who favored European-style shaydocks or flamboyant architectural statements, Rockefeller approached the project methodically, beginning not with a grand vision of a single house, but with the acquisition of land, parcel by parcel, often quietly and through intermediaries, eventually assembling thousands of acres that included farmland, forests, and existing tenant houses. And this process alone took years, reflecting Rockefeller's patience and preference for control over speed. And during this early phase, the estate that would become Kykuit existed not as a finished concept, but as an evolving experiment, shaped by Rockefeller's personal habits, his family life, and his increasing interest in health, routine, and moral order, as he sought a place where he could walk daily, oversee operations, and impose structure on both land and household. And initially, the Rockefellers occupied a more modest residence on the property, a house that served practical needs, but did not yet reflect the ambition that would later define Kykuit. And even at this stage, the estate functioned as a working environment, with farms producing food, staff managing grounds, and systems being put in place to support long-term habitation, rather than seasonal extravagance. And this practical foundation is critical to understanding Kykuit's origins. Because unlike many Gilded Age estates that were conceived as showpieces from the outset, Kykuit emerged gradually, shaped by use rather than spectacle. And as Rockefeller's family grew, with children and later grandchildren spending increasing amounts of time at the estate, the need for a more substantial residence became apparent, not only to accommodate family life, but to serve as a central administrative and symbolic hub for property that was becoming a small, self-contained world. And yet even then, Rockefeller remained cautious, commissioning studies, consulting architects, and revising plans repeatedly, reflecting both his indecisive tendencies in aesthetic matters and his insistence on functional excellence. And early architectural efforts did not immediately succeed, with initial designs failing to satisfy Rockefeller's expectations, leading to delays, alterations, and even the partial dismantling of earlier construction. An episode that would become emblematic of the estate's long gestation period. And during these years, the surrounding landscape continued to be reshaped, with roads rerouted, hills graded, and views carefully framed, as Rockefeller developed a particular obsession with sightlines, believing that what one saw from any given point should be deliberate and controlled, a philosophy that extended from the placement of trees to the alignment of paths and walls. And this attention to landscape foreshadowed what would later become one of Kykuit's defining features, its terraces and gardens, which were conceived not merely as decoration, but as structured environments that imposed order on nature, reflecting Rockefeller's worldview. And while the house itself remained unfinished, the estate was already functioning as a statement of power, scale, and permanence, even if that statement was understated compared to the flamboyant excesses of other contemporary magnates. And socially, the Rockefellers' presence in the Hudson Valley reinforced existing patterns of elite settlement while also subtly altering them, as the sheer scale of the estate limited public access, reshaped local economies, and established new relationships between landowner and community, with Rockefeller employing large numbers of local workers, setting standards for behavior and maintenance, and exerting influence through philanthropy and employment rather than ostentatious social display. And this approach mirrored his broader public image, one that emphasized piety, restraint, and moral responsibility, even as his business practices were often criticized for ruthlessness and consolidation of power. And Kykuit, in its early years, became a physical manifestation of these contradictions, a place of quiet grandeur built on immense wealth, designed to appear orderly and restrained, yet underpinned by the vast resources of Standard Oil. And as the 20th century approached, the estate stood at a crossroads, its land secured, its purpose defined, but its central residence still unresolved, reflecting both Rockefeller's perfectionism and the broader uncertainty of an era in which America's industrial elite were still negotiating how to translate unprecedented wealth into lasting cultural and architectural forms. And it is within this context of gradual accumulation, careful planning, and unresolved ambition that the story of Kykuit truly begins. Not as a finished masterpiece, but as a living project shaped by time, family, landscape, and the mindset of a man who believed that order, once imposed, could endure for generations, setting the stage for the architectural, artistic, and cultural developments that would eventually transform the estate into one of the most significant private residences in American history, a transformation that would unfold slowly, deliberately, and not without conflict. As Kykuit moved from concept to reality in the years that followed, as the 20th century began to edge closer, the Rockefeller estate at Kykuit entered a phase defined less by land acquisition and more by architectural frustration, revision, and persistence. Because while John D. Rockefeller had succeeded in assembling one of the most commanding properties in the Hudson Valley, he had not yet achieved a residence that satisfied his expectations for permanence, functionality, and symbolic weight. And this mismatch between land and house became increasingly difficult to ignore as the estate's operations expanded and family life grew more complex, pushing Rockefeller to finally commit to constructing a main house worthy of serving as the estate's nucleus. Though commit, in Rockefeller terms, still meant years of deliberation, revisions, and reversals, and the earliest serious attempt at building a grand residence resulted in a structure that was widely regarded, even by Rockefeller himself, as a disappointment, a bulky and poorly proportioned house that failed to harmonize with the landscape or reflect the clarity and order he prized. And rather than accept this outcome out of sunk cost or pride, Rockefeller made the characteristically ruthless decision to partially demolish and redesign the structure, an act that stunned observers and reinforced his reputation for uncompromising standards, especially when applied to projects funded by his own fortune. And this episode underscores a critical aspect of Kykuit's history, that it was never a straightforward expression of wealth, but a prolonged process of correction, adjustment, and control, driven by a man who believed inefficiency and disorder were moral failings as much as practical ones. And during this period of architectural uncertainty, Rockefeller increasingly relied on his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., whose role in shaping the estate would become more pronounced over time, especially as the elder Rockefeller aged and gradually withdrew from direct management of both business and household affairs, and Rockefeller Jr., though deeply influenced by his father's values, possessed a more refined aesthetic sensibility and a greater interest in art, architecture, and cultural legacy, which would later leave a visible imprint on Kykuit. But at this stage, the estate remained largely utilitarian in spirit, with emphasis placed on comfort, routine, and efficiency rather than display. and daily life at Kykuit followed a strict rhythm, reflecting Rockefeller S.R.'s obsession with regularity, including scheduled walks, meals, work periods, and rest. All conducted within an environment designed to minimize unpredictability, and the estate's layout facilitated this routine, with carefully planned paths, sheltered routes, and vantage points that allowed Rockefeller to survey his surroundings without intrusion, reinforcing his sense of control over both environment and self. And while guests were occasionally entertained, Kykuit was not yet a major social hub in the manner of other Gilded Age estates, serving instead as a private domain where family and trusted associates could operate away from public scrutiny. And this relative isolation was intentional, particularly as Rockefeller's public image became increasingly complicated by criticism of Standard Oil, antitrust actions, and growing resentment toward concentrated wealth, making privacy not merely a preference but a necessity. And within this context, Kykuit functioned as a refuge where Rockefeller could cultivate an image of moral rectitude, engaging in Bible study, philanthropy, and family life, while remaining insulated from the turbulence of urban politics and press attention. And the estate's farms and service buildings played a crucial role in this self-contained world, supplying food, maintaining infrastructure, and providing employment, all under strict supervision, and Rockefeller took a keen interest in these operations, often involving himself in minor details, from crop yields to maintenance schedules, reinforcing the sense that Kykuit was less a retreat from work than a different form of it, one centered on management rather than commerce. And as architectural plans continued to evolve, Rockefeller Jr. increasingly pushed for a more coherent and dignified design, eventually turning to architects who could balance classical form with modern functionality, setting the stage for the eventual emergence of Kykuit's distinctive appearance. But progress remained slow, complicated by disagreements over style, scale, and purpose, with Rockefeller S.R. favoring restraint and practicality, while his son advocated for a residence that could endure as a cultural and familial symbol. And this generational tension played out not through open conflict, but through prolonged negotiation, revisions, and compromises, all of which delayed completion but also enriched the final result. And meanwhile, the surrounding grounds underwent significant transformation, as landscape architects and planners refined terraces, gardens, and circulation routes, emphasizing axial symmetry and controlled vistas, drawing inspiration from European estates while adapting them to the Hudson Valley's terrain. And these outdoor spaces began to take on an identity of their own, functioning as extensions of the house rather than mere surroundings, a concept that would later define Kykuit's aesthetic legacy. And by the time the main residence began to approach a more finalized form, the estate had already developed a layered character, combining working farms, formal gardens, service areas, and private retreats into a unified whole, reflecting both Rockefeller's desire for order and his recognition that a great estate required complexity beneath its surface calm. And socially, Kykuit's role continued to evolve, gradually becoming a site where business leaders, philanthropists, and intellectuals might be received, though always within carefully managed boundaries, reinforcing the idea that access to the Rockefellers and their world was conditional and controlled. And as the years passed, the estate increasingly symbolized not just personal wealth, but the transition of that wealth into a legacy, something that could outlast its creator. And this shift in focus, from immediate utility to long-term significance, marked a turning point in Kykuit's development, setting the stage for the artistic, architectural, and cultural investments that would soon transform it from a private refuge into a landmark of American elite culture, a transformation that would accelerate as new influences, new ambitions, and new generations took greater responsibility for shaping its future. By the time the main house at Kykuit finally began to settle into a form that felt intentional rather than provisional, the estate itself had already taken on a rhythm that mirrored the internal evolution of the Rockefeller family, especially the gradual shift of influence from John D. Rockefeller to his son. And this transition mattered because the future character of Kykuit would be shaped less by the habits of a single industrial titan, and more by the layered priorities of a family, increasingly aware that its wealth carried cultural and historical consequences, not just financial ones. And during this period, the architectural direction of the house moved decisively toward a restrained classical style, drawing from Renaissance villas rather than the flamboyant excess common among contemporaneous mansions. A choice that reflected a desire for dignity and permanence rather than spectacle, and the completed structure, finally accepted after years of revisions, featured clean limestone facades, balanced proportions, and a commanding position atop the hill that emphasized stability and order, not domination. And while the house was undeniably grand, its restraint was deliberate, a visual argument that wealth could be disciplined, controlled, and even morally neutral if expressed correctly. And inside, the layout reinforced this philosophy, with rooms arranged to support both family life and formal receiving without encouraging ostentation, and circulation paths that prioritized clarity and separation between public and private spaces, allowing the Rockefellers to host guests without surrendering the privacy that had always been central to the estate's purpose. And this careful orchestration extended to the estate's staff operations, which by now functioned with near-industrial efficiency, employing dozens of workers across maintenance, agriculture, security, and domestic service, all coordinated through a hierarchy that echoed the organizational logic of Rockefeller's business empire. And despite the scale of this operation, the estate maintained a quiet atmosphere, in part because noise, unpredictability, and disorder were actively engineered out of the environment through thoughtful planning and strict rules. And this quietness became one of Kykuit's defining characteristics, setting it apart from the more theatrical estates of the era. And as the physical form of the house stabilized, attention increasingly turned to the surrounding grounds, which underwent extensive refinement under the guidance of landscape architects who treated the hillside as a series of outdoor rooms, connected by terraces, stairways, and axial paths that framed views of the Hudson River below. And these gardens were not designed for casual wandering, but for deliberate movement, encouraging visitors to experience the estate as a sequence of composed moments, each revealing a different balance of nature and structure. And sculptures and fountains were introduced gradually, chosen not for extravagance but for symbolic resonance, often drawing from classical mythology or abstract forms that suggested continuity with older cultural traditions. And this integration of art into the landscape marked a subtle but important shift in the estate's identity, signaling that Kykuit was becoming not just a residence but a curated environment. And this shift aligned closely with the interests of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., whose growing involvement brought a more explicit emphasis on culture, education, and philanthropy. And while his father had viewed wealth primarily as a resource to be managed responsibly, Rockefeller, Jr. increasingly viewed it as a tool for shaping society. And Kykuit became one of the places where this philosophy was tested and refined, hosting conversations about social reform, urban planning, religion, and education, often among a carefully selected circle of guests who shared or challenged these ideas within controlled boundaries. And these gatherings, though modest in scale, contributed to the estate's emerging role as an intellectual as well as familial center. And internally, family life at Kykuit reflected a blend of formality and intimacy, with children raised in an environment that emphasized discipline, routine, and moral instruction, while still offering access to expansive grounds, private tutors, and cultural exposure. And the estate's isolation reinforced a sense of separation from ordinary urban life, shaping a worldview that combined privilege with a strong sense of obligation. And this duality would become a defining feature of the Rockefeller legacy. And as years passed, the elder Rockefeller's presence became less dominant, though his influence remained embedded in the estate's structure and daily rhythms. and his eventual withdrawal from active oversight allowed Rockefeller Jr. to pursue a more ambitious vision for Kykuit, one that extended beyond architecture and landscaping into the realm of collecting art, preserving history, and consciously constructing a narrative of American success rooted in discipline rather than excess. And this narrative was reflected in the estate's growing art collection, which began to include modern works alongside classical pieces, signaling an openness to new ideas that contrasted with the conservative image often associated with old wealth. And these acquisitions were not displayed ostentatiously, but integrated into living spaces and gardens, reinforcing the idea that art was meant to be lived with rather than merely observed. And by this stage, Kykuit had fully transitioned from a personal retreat into a symbol of continuity, one that balanced past achievement with future aspiration. And yet, despite its increasing complexity and cultural weight, the estate retained a sense of inward focus, resisting the temptation to become a public monument or social stage. And this restraint ensured that Kykuit remained adaptable, capable of evolving with each generation while maintaining a core identity rooted in order, reflection, and deliberate purpose. An identity that would be tested and expanded as the 20th century progressed, and the Rockefeller family's role in American life grew ever more visible and influential. As the 20th century moved forward and Kykuit settled into its role as the primary Rockefeller family seat, the estate increasingly reflected the broader transformations underway in American society, even as it seemed insulated from them. Because while industrialization, labor unrest, and rapid urban growth reshaped daily life for millions, life at Kykuit remained carefully structured, deliberately calm, and highly controlled. And this contrast was not accidental but ideological, rooted in the Rockefeller belief that order, planning, and moral discipline were the correct responses to the chaos of modernity. And during this period, John D. Rockefeller Jr. emerged fully as the guiding force behind the estate, not merely as an inheritor of wealth but as an architect of legacy. And under his stewardship, Kykuit became more intentionally aligned with his values, particularly his deep interest in religion, social responsibility, and institutional reform. And this influence manifested physically through continued refinement of the house and grounds, but more importantly through how the estate was used, as Kykuit increasingly functioned as a place of deliberation, reflection, and long-term planning rather than retreat or display. And Rockefeller Jr. approached the estate almost as a laboratory for testing ideas about how wealth should behave in a democratic society, hosting private meetings that brought together clergy, educators, economists, and reformers, often under strict conditions of privacy, allowing for candid discussion without public scrutiny. And these gatherings reinforced the sense that Kykuit was not a social hub in the conventional sense, but a controlled intellectual environment. And this approach extended to the family's daily routines, which emphasized punctuality, modesty, and service, values instilled deliberately in the children through structured schedules, religious instruction, and expectations of personal responsibility. Even within an environment of extraordinary privilege, and the estate itself supported this worldview through its spatial logic, with clear separations between work and leisure, public and private, contemplation and activity. And while the gardens and terraces provided beauty and respite, they were also designed to encourage reflection rather than indulgence, often framing distant views rather than overwhelming the senses with decoration. And as the estate matured, its relationship to art continued to evolve, with Rockefeller Jr. developing a more systematic approach to collecting, guided by advisors who helped him acquire works that aligned with his belief in art as a civilizing force. And this philosophy favored pieces that conveyed balance, craftsmanship, and moral seriousness, though it did not exclude modernism entirely, and sculptures placed throughout the gardens became increasingly significant, transforming the landscape into an outdoor gallery that blended nature, architecture, and artistic expression into a unified whole. And these works were positioned carefully to interact with their surroundings, often revealed gradually along paths or framed by architectural elements, reinforcing the idea that art should reward attention and patience. And internally, the house's interiors reflected a similar balance, with rooms furnished elegantly but without excessive ornamentation, relying on proportion, material quality, and subtle detailing rather than overt luxury. And this restraint was itself a statement, particularly at a time when other wealthy families were constructing increasingly extravagant homes as symbols of status. And Kykuit's refusal to compete on those terms reinforced the Rockefellers' desire to present their wealth as purposeful rather than self-indulgent and beyond aesthetics. The estate became increasingly involved in the logistical and moral complexities of managing a large workforce, as dozens of employees lived and worked on the grounds, often for many years, creating a semi-contained community governed by rules and expectations that mirrored the family's values. And while conditions were generally stable and employment was often long-term, the hierarchy was rigid, and the separation between family and staff was carefully maintained, reflecting broader class structures of the era, even as the Rockefellers supported progressive causes publicly. And this tension between idealism and hierarchy was not lost on Rockefeller Jr., who spent considerable time thinking about labor relations, philanthropy, and the ethical obligations of employers, particularly in the aftermath of events like the Ludlow Massacre, which deeply affected him and reshaped his approach to social responsibility. And Kykuit became one of the places where he processed these experiences, both privately and through conversations with advisors and religious figures. And this introspective use of the estate added another layer to its identity, transforming it into a space not just of legacy building, but of moral reckoning. And during this same period, the estate's infrastructure continued to modernize, incorporating advances in technology that improved comfort and efficiency while remaining largely invisible, including updated heating systems, electrical improvements, and communication technologies that allowed the family to remain connected to business and philanthropic operations without disrupting the estate's atmosphere. And these upgrades were implemented carefully to avoid altering the house's outward appearance or internal harmony, reflecting an ongoing commitment to blending modern function with timeless form. And as the years passed, Kykuit increasingly symbolized continuity in an era of rapid change, serving as a physical anchor for a family whose influence extended far beyond the Hudson Valley. And yet, despite its growing symbolic weight, the estate remained deliberately private, rarely open to outsiders and shielded from public curiosity by both geography and policy. And this privacy allowed the Rockefellers to shape the estate on their own terms, free from the pressures of fashion or public opinion. And by this stage, Kykuit had become something more complex than a mansion or even a family seat. It had become a carefully constructed environment designed to embody a philosophy of wealth that emphasized stewardship, restraint, and long-term thinking. A philosophy that would soon face new tests as global conflict, economic upheaval, and cultural transformation began to reshape the world beyond its walls, setting the stage for the next phase of the estate's history. By the time the world moved into the shadow of the First World War, and then staggered toward the uneasy calm that followed, Kykuit had fully transitioned from a symbol of industrial triumph into something more inward-facing and deliberate. And this shift mirrored John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s own evolution as he stepped further away from direct business leadership and deeper into philanthropy, urban planning, and global reform efforts. And the estate increasingly functioned as a strategic retreat where ideas were shaped quietly before being deployed on a national or international scale. And while the house itself remained visually unchanged to outside observers, its purpose subtly transformed as meetings held within its walls began to influence universities, churches, housing projects, and cultural institutions far beyond the Hudson Valley. And during this period, Rockefeller Jr. devoted significant attention to refining the systems that governed life at Kykuit, believing that even a private estate should operate according to principles of efficiency, accountability, and moral order. And this resulted in increasingly formalized management structures for staff, grounds, and household operations. With detailed record-keeping and clearly defined roles that reflected his belief that discipline and clarity were prerequisites for ethical leadership. And the estate thus became a microcosm of the larger organizational philosophies he promoted through his foundations. And at the same time, family life at Kykuit took on greater importance as the next generation of Rockefellers grew older. With Rockefeller Jr. and his wife Abby using the estate as a controlled environment in which to raise children who were acutely aware of their privilege, but trained to see it as responsibility rather than entitlement. And this balance was carefully maintained through routines that mixed rigorous education with physical activity, religious study, and exposure to art and culture, all framed by the belief that wealth carried obligations that extended far beyond personal comfort. And Abby Rockefeller in particular played a growing role during this era, bringing her own sensibilities into the life of the estate, especially her deepening interest in modern art, which at first existed in tension with her husband's more conservative aesthetic preferences. And this tension slowly reshaped Kykuit's cultural identity as new works began to appear within the house, challenging traditional definitions of beauty and value. And while Rockefeller Jr. initially approached modern art with skepticism, he tolerated and eventually supported Abby's collecting efforts, recognizing that cultural evolution required openness to new forms of expression, and this dynamic added an element of creative friction to the estate, transforming it into a space where tradition and experimentation coexisted uneasily but productively. And beyond the house itself, the surrounding landscape continued to evolve as gardens were adjusted, sculptures repositioned, and pathways refined to enhance both visual impact and symbolic meaning. And the estate's famous sculpture collection expanded during this time, incorporating works that reflected a broader range of styles and philosophies, reinforcing the idea that Kykuit was not frozen in a single historical moment, but engaged in an ongoing dialogue with the present. And these changes occurred quietly, without public announcement or spectacle, consistent with the family's preference for understatement, and yet the effects were profound, as Kykuit increasingly embodied a layered identity, at once a home, a cultural institution, a planning center, and a moral workshop. And this complexity deepened as the economic instability of the 1920s and the looming crash of 1929 began to reshape the national landscape, forcing Rockefeller Jr. and his peers to confront new questions about capitalism, inequality, and social stability. And while Kykuit remained materially insulated from the immediate effects of economic collapse, it became a site of intense reflection during the Great Depression, with Rockefeller Jr. grappling privately with the paradox of immense private wealth existing alongside widespread public suffering. And this internal conflict influenced decisions made within the estate's walls, including expanded philanthropic commitments and increased engagement with urban redevelopment projects aimed at alleviating poverty and restoring civic order. And Kykuit served as a quiet nerve center for these efforts, offering the privacy necessary for difficult conversations and long-term planning. And during these years, the estate's atmosphere reportedly grew more subdued, with fewer large gatherings and a greater emphasis on family cohesion and purposeful activity. And even leisure at Kykuit took on a more restrained tone, reflecting the broader cultural shift toward austerity and seriousness. And yet the estate did not retreat from its role as a cultural incubator, as Abby Rockefeller's involvement in the founding of the Museum of Modern Art drew new artistic energy into the family's orbit, and discussions held at Kykuit increasingly touched on the role of art in shaping modern society, reinforcing the estate's function as a place where abstract ideas were tested against lived experience. And this period also saw technological updates that subtly altered daily life, including improvements in transportation access, communication systems, and household conveniences, all implemented in ways that preserved the estate's calm and order. And these updates ensured that Kykuit remained functional and relevant without sacrificing its architectural integrity. And by the mid-1930s, the estate had accumulated decades of layered meaning, shaped by ambition, restraint, conflict, and reflection, standing not as a monument to a single man or moment, but as a living environment that absorbed and responded to the pressures of its time. And as global tensions began to rise once again, hinting at conflicts that would dwarf even the upheavals of the previous decades, Kykuit stood poised on the edge of another transformation. Its future role uncertain, but its capacity for adaptation already deeply ingrained, setting the stage for how the estate and the family who inhabited it would respond to the coming storm. As the world moved fully into the era of the Second World War, Kykuit entered one of the most complex and quietly consequential phases of its existence, not because of any visible transformation to the house or grounds, but because of how the estate functioned as a psychological and strategic anchor during a time when uncertainty became the dominant global condition. And while the Rockefellers were physically removed from battlefields and bombed cities, the decisions shaped in places like Kykuit reverberated far beyond its stone walls and terraced gardens. And during these years, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., was deeply engaged in questions of moral responsibility during wartime, particularly regarding international cooperation, post-war reconstruction, and the long-term consequences of unchecked nationalism. And Kykuit once again became a retreat where he could withdraw from public scrutiny, while remaining intensely focused on shaping outcomes that would extend into the future. And the estate's isolation, once designed to provide peace and order, now served another purpose, allowing uninterrupted concentration on ideas that demanded patience and long vision rather than immediate results. And meetings held at Kykuit during this period often involved planners, theologians, economists, and diplomats. Individuals who were thinking not just about winning a war, but about preventing the next one. And the tone of these gatherings was markedly different from the industrial optimism that had defined the estate's earliest years, replaced instead by a sober awareness of how fragile civilization could be when systems failed or were weaponized. And this awareness influenced Rockefeller Jr.'s growing interest in international institutions, most notably his support for what would eventually become the United Nations, an idea rooted in the belief that peace required structure, accountability, and shared values, all concepts that had quietly guided the design and operation of Kykuit itself for decades. And while these global ambitions unfolded largely behind the scenes, life at the estate continued with a disciplined regularity that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the outside world. And this consistency was not accidental, as Rockefeller Jr. believed that maintaining order at home was a moral necessity during a time when disorder was widespread, and this philosophy shaped everything from household routines to staff management, reinforcing the idea that stability was an active practice rather than a passive condition. And the estate staff during the war years experienced both continuity and change, as some younger employees left for military service while others took on expanded roles. And despite wartime constraints, the Rockefellers made deliberate efforts to preserve employment and provide support where possible, reflecting a paternalistic but sincere sense of responsibility toward those who depended on the estate for their livelihood. And this dynamic reinforced Kykuit's function as a self-contained ecosystem, buffered from external shocks yet still responsive to them in measured ways. And within the family, the war years marked a turning point for the Rockefeller children, many of whom were now adults with their own emerging roles in business, philanthropy, and public service. And Kykuit became a place where generational perspectives intersected, sometimes clashing, sometimes aligning. As younger family members questioned established assumptions while still operating within the moral framework their parents had instilled, and these internal conversations reflected broader societal shifts, as traditional hierarchies were challenged, and new definitions of leadership began to emerge. And Abby Rockefeller's influence continued to expand during this time, particularly in the realm of culture, as modern art, once controversial, gained greater acceptance as a legitimate expression of contemporary experience, and the presence of modern works at Kykuit now felt less like a provocation and more like a natural evolution, signaling the estate's willingness to adapt aesthetically as well as philosophically. And this adaptability proved crucial as the war drew to a close and the world faced the daunting task of rebuilding, and Kykuit once again shifted roles, becoming a place where post-war priorities were debated and refined, including urban renewal, education reform, and international development, and Rockefeller Jr.'s belief that private wealth could and should be used to stabilize society found renewed urgency in the aftermath of global devastation. And the estate's atmosphere during these years was reportedly one of cautious optimism tempered by hard-earned realism, a recognition that peace was not an endpoint but a process requiring constant maintenance. And this mindset influenced the ways in which the Rockefellers approached philanthropy in the late 1940s, increasingly emphasizing long-term institutional support rather than short-term relief, and Kykuit functioned as both a planning hub and a symbolic reminder of what continuity looked like in a fractured world. And even as the United States entered a period of economic expansion and cultural confidence, the estate retained its restrained character, resisting the temptation to become a showpiece of post-war excess, and instead it embodied a quieter form of authority rooted in endurance, discipline, and accumulated experience. And this restraint extended to how Kykuit was perceived publicly, as the family continued to limit access and publicity, allowing the estate to exist largely outside the growing culture of celebrity and spectacle. And this deliberate distance reinforced the idea that Kykuit was not meant to impress the masses, but to serve as a working environment for ideas that required insulation from distraction. And yet, despite its privacy, the estate's influence continued to spread indirectly through the institutions and initiatives that traced their origins back to conversations held there. And by the early 1950s, as the Cold War reshaped global politics and introduced new anxieties about technology, ideology, and existential risk, Kykuit stood once again at the threshold of another era, its role as a stabilizing force tested by a world increasingly defined by speed and abstraction. And the question looming over the estate was no longer how to build or preserve it, but how to ensure that its values could remain relevant in a future that seemed determined to move faster than reflection itself. As the Cold War hardened into a defining reality of the mid-20th century, Kykuit entered a phase where its significance became less about the presence of its original builder and more about how the estate functioned as a bridge between generations, ideologies, and evolving definitions of responsibility. And although John D. Rockefeller Jr. was gradually stepping back from active leadership, his influence remained deeply embedded in the rhythms of the house and the expectations placed upon those who inherited both the property and the legacy attached to it. And during these years, the estate increasingly reflected the priorities of the Rockefeller children, particularly Nelson Rockefeller, whose political ambitions and expansive worldview brought a new kind of energy and tension to Kykuit, and where his father had favored restraint, contemplation, and moral framing. Nelson operated with a restless drive shaped by modern politics, media visibility, and a belief that leadership required bold public engagement rather than quiet stewardship. And this generational contrast did not dismantle Kykuit's identity, but complicated it, transforming the estate into a place where old ideals were tested against new realities. And Nelson's frequent use of Kykuit as a retreat and meeting place reflected his need for a controlled environment where strategy could be discussed away from the noise of New York City. And during his time as governor of New York, the estate became an informal extension of his political life, hosting advisors, donors, and intellectuals who debated issues ranging from infrastructure development to Cold War diplomacy. And unlike earlier periods where such gatherings were marked by a sense of distance from public affairs, these meetings were explicitly political, signaling a shift in how Kykuit interacted with the outside world. And yet, even as the estate became more entwined with contemporary power structures, it retained its disciplined aesthetic and operational order, acting as a stabilizing counterweight to the volatility of mid-century politics and the physical environment of Kykuit. With its layered terraces, controlled sightlines, and deliberate separation between public and private spaces, proved well suited to this new role, offering both grandeur and containment, and this architectural logic mirrored Nelson Rockefeller's own approach to leadership, combining spectacle with control, visibility with structure, and the presence of modern art at the estate expanded further during this period, not merely as decoration, but as a statement of alignment with progress, experimentation, and intellectual openness, and sculptures by contemporary artists were integrated into the gardens, reinforcing the idea that Kykuit was not frozen in the past, but actively conversing with the present. And this evolution sometimes created friction within the family, particularly among those who viewed the estate as a repository of tradition rather than a platform for reinvention. And these internal debates echoed broader cultural tensions of the era. As American society grappled with rapid technological change, shifting social norms, and the anxiety of living under the shadow of nuclear conflict, and Kykuit became a place where these anxieties could be processed privately, through discussion rather than demonstration. And even as the Rockefellers publicly projected confidence and authority, the estate provided a space where uncertainty could be acknowledged without undermining public posture. And this function became increasingly important as the Cold War introduced a sense of permanent instability, where long-term planning had to account for unprecedented risks, and the conversations held at Kykuit during these years often reflected this awareness, focusing on systems resilience, international cooperation, and the ethical implications of power in an age where destruction could be instantaneous and irreversible. And while Kykuit itself remained physically unchanged, its symbolic weight grew heavier, carrying the accumulated expectations of a family whose influence now extended into politics, culture, and global affairs. And the estate staff continued to adapt to these shifts, managing increased security concerns, accommodating high-profile visitors, and maintaining discretion amid heightened scrutiny. And this professionalism reinforced the estate's reputation as a controlled environment where serious work could occur without disruption. And despite the growing pace of modern life, Kykuit resisted modernization in its daily operations, preserving routines that emphasized order, punctuality, and clear hierarchy. And this resistance was intentional, reflecting a belief that not all progress required acceleration, and that some values were best preserved through consistency rather than innovation. And as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, with their social upheavals and challenges to established authority, Kykuit stood in quiet contrast to the cultural revolutions unfolding elsewhere, not because it was unaware of them, but because it processed change differently, absorbing new ideas selectively rather than reacting impulsively. And this selective adaptation became a defining characteristic of the estate during this era, allowing it to remain relevant without losing coherence. And even as protests, civil rights struggles, and generational conflicts reshaped the American landscape, Kykuit maintained its inward focus, serving as a place where long-term responses could be considered beyond the immediacy of headlines. And this approach sometimes drew criticism, particularly from those who viewed elite spaces like Kykuit as disconnected from lived realities. But within the Rockefeller family, there was a growing awareness that insulation carried both advantages and moral risks, and this awareness influenced philanthropic strategies that increasingly sought engagement with urban issues, education, and social equity. And while these efforts often played out far from Sleepy Hollow, their conceptual foundations were frequently discussed at Kykuit, where the family could reflect on how to reconcile privilege with responsibility in a rapidly changing society. And by the late 1960s, as John D. Rockefeller Jr. approached the end of his life, the estate took on a more explicitly reflective tone, becoming a place where legacy was not just inherited but interrogated. And the question facing the family was no longer how to wield power effectively, but how to ensure that the structures they had built could adapt ethically to a world that increasingly questioned the legitimacy of inherited authority. And Kykuit, with its layered history and controlled environment, remained central to that reckoning, standing not as an answer, but as a setting where the hardest questions could be faced without spectacle or retreat. As the turbulence of the late 1960s and early 1970s settled into a more uncertain and fragmented era, Kykuit began to transition once again, this time from a living center of active power into something quieter, more institutional in character. And this shift was neither abrupt nor entirely intentional, but rather the cumulative result of aging family members, changing political fortunes, and a broader cultural skepticism toward dynastic influence. And with the death of John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1960, and the later passing of Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, the moral and emotional anchors of the estate faded into memory, leaving subsequent generations to determine what Kykuit should represent in a world increasingly suspicious of inherited authority and concentrated wealth. And during this period, Nelson Rockefeller's political career reached both its height and its limits, culminating in his tenure as Vice President of the United States, a role that carried prestige but relatively little independent power. And as his public life became more constrained by national politics, the role of Kykuit shifted accordingly, no longer serving as a strategic hub in quite the same way, but instead becoming a place of retreat, reflection, and consolidation. And this quieter use of the estate mirrored a larger retreat of elite families from overt displays of centralized influence, as power became more dispersed across institutions, corporations, and bureaucratic systems, rather than embodied in individual figures. And within the Rockefeller family, discussions increasingly focused on preservation rather than expansion, stewardship rather than leadership. And this philosophical change had tangible effects on how Kykuit was maintained and understood. And while the physical structure of the estate remained intact, its symbolic role evolved from that of a private seat of influence to a historical artifact that needed interpretation and contextualization. And this process was gradual, shaped by debates within the family about privacy, public access, and the responsibilities attached to owning a property so deeply intertwined with American history. And some family members viewed opening Kykuit to the public as a necessary step toward transparency and relevance, while others feared that doing so would reduce a deeply personal space into a curated spectacle. And these tensions reflected broader cultural debates of the late 20th century. As historic preservation movements gained momentum and public interest in elite domestic spaces, grew alongside criticism of the inequalities they represented. And Kykuit sat squarely at the center of these contradictions, admired for its architectural coherence and artistic significance, yet inseparable from the economic systems that had made its construction possible. And as the estate aged, practical concerns also came to the forefront, including the immense cost of maintenance, the challenges of preserving early 20th century infrastructure, and the need to adapt to modern safety and conservation standards without altering the character of the house. And these logistical realities pushed the family toward collaboration with preservation experts, historians, and eventually public institutions, further shifting control away from purely private decision-making. And during the 1970s and 1980s, Kykuit increasingly functioned as a semi-formalized family residence, used intermittently rather than continuously. And this intermittent use subtly altered the atmosphere of the estate, changing it from a lived-in environment to a carefully maintained one, where continuity was achieved through planning rather than habit. And the staff's role evolved as well, with an increasing emphasis on conservation, documentation, and institutional memory, ensuring that the knowledge required to maintain the estate did not disappear as long-serving employees retired. And this professionalization of stewardship marked another step away from the personalized household model that had defined Kykuit in its early decades. And as the estate's daily rhythm slowed, its historical significance became more pronounced, and scholars, curators, and cultural commentators began to frame Kykuit not just as a Rockefeller home, but as a lens through which to examine broader themes in American history, including industrialization, philanthropy, elite culture, and the evolution of private wealth into public legacy. And this reframing did not erase the family's presence, but it repositioned them as subjects of historical inquiry rather than active protagonists. And the art collections housed at Kykuit took on new importance in this context, serving as tangible evidence of shifting tastes, cultural aspirations, and ideological commitments across generations. And the juxtaposition of classical European works with modernist sculptures underscored the estate's role as a site of transition, reflecting how American elites negotiated their relationship to tradition and innovation. And by the late 20th century, Kykuit increasingly existed in a state of dual identity, both private and public, personal and symbolic, and this duality required careful management to avoid diluting either aspect, and decisions about access, interpretation, and presentation were approached cautiously, often framed as experiments rather than permanent changes. And this cautious approach reflected an awareness that once an estate like Kykuit fully entered the public sphere, its meaning would inevitably be reshaped by external narratives and expectations. And yet the alternative, total withdrawal, risked rendering the property irrelevant or unsustainable. And this balancing act became one of the defining challenges of the estate's later history. And as American society moved toward the end of the 20th century, with increasing emphasis on transparency, inclusion, and historical accountability, the pressure to contextualize Kykuit within a broader social framework intensified, and the Rockefeller family's long tradition of philanthropy played a role in shaping how this transition unfolded, providing a conceptual bridge between private ownership and public benefit. And by positioning Kykuit as an educational and cultural resource rather than a monument to wealth, the family sought to align the estate with values that resonated beyond their own lineage. And this alignment was not purely rhetorical, but reflected genuine efforts to engage with historians, educators, and preservationists who could situate the estate within a nuanced historical narrative. And as these efforts progressed, Kykuit began to shed some of its mystique, not through exposure alone, but through explanation, and the stories embedded in its walls, gardens, and collections were increasingly framed as part of a shared national history rather than a closed family chronicle. And this reframing did not resolve all tensions, but it marked a decisive shift in how Kykuit related to the world beyond its gates, preparing the estate for its final transformation from a lived center of power into a carefully interpreted historical landmark. A place where the legacy of one of America's most influential families could be examined with both admiration and critical distance, and where the question was no longer who held power within its walls, but what lessons those walls might offer to those who passed through them. As Kykuit moved fully into the closing decades of the 20th century, its identity as a private family stronghold finally gave way to a more deliberate and carefully managed public role. And this transition was less about opening gates than about redefining purpose, because by this point the estate was no longer central to decision-making or power consolidation within the Rockefeller family, but it had become something arguably more complex, a physical archive of ideas, values, contradictions, and aspirations that had shaped not only one dynasty but large portions of modern American life. And this realization forced a reckoning with what it meant to preserve a place whose significance was inseparable from both admiration and controversy. And unlike earlier periods when Kykuit's evolution was guided by a single dominant figure, this era was defined by committees, foundations, preservation boards, and advisors, reflecting a broader shift away from personalized authority toward institutional governance. And while this structure lacked the clarity and decisiveness of earlier leadership, it allowed for a more pluralistic interpretation of the estate's meaning, incorporating historical scholarship, curatorial practice, and public education into decisions that had once been purely private. And the transformation of Kykuit into a site that could be responsibly shared with the public required extensive preparation, not only in physical terms but also in narrative framing, because the story of the Rockefellers could not simply be celebrated without context, nor could it be reduced to a single moral lesson, and the challenge lay in presenting the estate as a place shaped by ambition, discipline, creativity, and privilege, while also acknowledging the broader economic and social systems that made such a place possible. And this challenge influenced everything from restoration priorities to interpretive materials, shaping how rooms were furnished, how artworks were displayed, and how the gardens were maintained, and preservation efforts increasingly focused on stabilizing rather than reinventing, ensuring that Kykuit remained as close as possible to its mid-20th century condition, when its layered identity was most fully developed. And this approach treated the estate not as a frozen moment from its earliest years, but as a living environment that had evolved over time. And this decision reflected a maturer understanding that historical authenticity often resides in accumulation rather than origin. And as tour and educational programs were developed, emphasis was placed on continuity and process rather than spectacle, highlighting how the estate functioned day to day, how decisions were made, and how values were translated into architecture, landscape, and routine. And this focus distinguished Kykuit from other historic homes that leaned heavily on glamour or eccentricity, reinforcing its identity as a place shaped by systems and philosophies rather than personalities alone. And the art collections played a crucial role in this interpretive shift, serving as tangible markers of generational change and intellectual openness. And visitors encountering the juxtaposition of classical European works with bold modernist sculptures were invited to consider how American elites negotiated tradition and innovation, certainty and experimentation, and this dialogue between past and present became one of the estate's most compelling narratives. And beyond the house itself, the grounds of Kykuit gained renewed attention as an integrated cultural landscape, with gardens, terraces, and pathways restored not simply for aesthetic pleasure, but as expressions of intentional design and symbolic order. And this holistic approach underscored the idea that Kykuit was never meant to be consumed quickly, but experienced slowly, through movement, perspective, and reflection. And as public access increased in controlled ways, the estate's former secrecy began to dissolve, replaced by a quieter form of authority rooted in transparency and education. And while some critics viewed this transition as a softening of legacy, others saw it as a necessary evolution, allowing Kykuit to remain relevant in a society that increasingly questioned inherited privilege and demanded accountability from historical institutions. And within the Rockefeller family, this period marked a shift from ownership as identity to stewardship as responsibility, with younger generations engaging less with the estate as a home and more as a trust, something to be protected, interpreted, and eventually handed forward. And this change altered the emotional relationship to the property, replacing personal memory with institutional continuity. And yet the estate retained an unmistakable presence, shaped by decades of careful decision-making and restraint. And even as it entered the public consciousness in new ways, it resisted simplification, refusing to become either a shrine or a cautionary tale, and instead it existed as a layered text, open to multiple readings depending on the perspective of those who engaged with it. And this openness was both its strength and its challenge, because it required ongoing interpretation rather than fixed conclusions. And as the 20th century drew to a close, Kykuit stood as an example of how private power could transition into public memory without collapsing under its own weight. And while it no longer shaped the future in the direct ways it once had, it continued to influence how that future understood the past, offering a space where questions about wealth, responsibility, culture, and legacy could be explored without the pressure of immediate answers. And this raw, quieter but enduring, ensured that Kykuit remained not just preserved, but alive within the broader narrative of American history, poised on the edge of a final transformation where the meaning of the estate would be defined not by those who built it, but by those who sought to understand it. As Kykuit entered the 21st century, its long transformation reached a quiet conclusion, not through a dramatic event or definitive statement, but through the steady accumulation of choices that clarified what the estate had ultimately become. And by this point, it no longer functioned as a center of power, nor even primarily as a family residence, but as a carefully preserved environment where the consequences of power, wealth, and long-term planning could be examined with distance and nuance. And this final phase of Kykuit's history was defined less by creation than by interpretation, as the focus shifted fully toward how the estate could serve as a public resource without losing the coherence that had defined it for more than a century. And this balance required restraint, the same restraint that had guided its original construction, because the temptation to dramatize, commercialize, or oversimplify such a storied place was always present. And resisting that temptation became a form of stewardship in itself, and the decision to place Kykuit under the care of preservation organizations ensured that its future would be guided by professional standards rather than personal preference, embedding the estate within a broader framework of cultural conservation that emphasized accuracy, context, and continuity. And this institutional approach allowed Kykuit to endure beyond the lifespan of any individual Rockefeller, transforming legacy into structure rather than memory. And as visitors began to move through the house and gardens, the estate revealed itself not as a monument to excess, but as a study in control, intentionality, and long-horizon thinking, where every architectural choice, landscape feature, and interior space reflected an underlying belief that order could be imposed on complexity through planning and discipline. And this belief, once the private philosophy of a single family, became accessible to a wider audience, not as instruction but as observation, and the experience of Kykuit invited reflection rather than awe, encouraging visitors to consider how environments shape behavior and how values are encoded into physical form. And this reflective quality distinguished Kykuit from other historic estates, positioning it as a place where questions were more important than answers, and where the legacy of wealth was presented not as triumph or failure, but as a continuous negotiation between intention and consequence. And the estate's art collections continue to play a central role in this dialogue, serving as evidence of evolving cultural priorities and the willingness of successive generations to engage with uncertainty, experimentation, and change. And the presence of modern art within such a historically grounded setting underscored one of Kykuit's most enduring themes, the idea that tradition and innovation need not exist in opposition, but can coexist within a carefully managed framework and beyond the walls of the house. The gardens and terraces remained as they had for decades, structured yet open, offering views that emphasized perspective over dominance, and these landscapes reinforced the estate's final identity as a place designed for contemplation rather than command. And as time passed, Kykuit's relevance shifted further away from the specifics of the Rockefeller family and toward the broader questions their story raised, about how private wealth intersects with public responsibility, how power is exercised and restrained, and how long-term thinking can shape not just institutions, but physical environments. And in this sense, Kykuit became less about who built it and more about what it demonstrated, a case study in how ambition can be translated into structure, and how structure can endure beyond ambition itself. And the estate's survival into the modern era was not guaranteed, but the fact that it endured intact, coherent, and interpretable spoke to the effectiveness of its underlying philosophy. And unlike places that were abandoned, demolished, or radically altered, Kykuit remained legible, its original intentions still visible even as their relevance evolved, and this legibility allowed it to function as a bridge between eras, connecting the industrial age that created it to the contemporary world that now examines it. And in doing so, it offered a rare opportunity to engage with history not as a distant abstraction, but as a constructed environment shaped by deliberate choices. And the final significance of Kykuit lay not in its size, its wealth, or its famous name, but in its ability to endure without spectacle, to adapt without erasure, and to invite scrutiny without defensiveness. And as a result, the estate no longer needed to assert its importance, because its continued presence, carefully maintained and thoughtfully interpreted, was itself the conclusion of its story, a demonstration that legacy, when managed with patience and restraint, can shift from private possession to shared understanding without losing its integrity.